Welcome, viewers. Again, we are on the line, and many discussions we have arranged earlier. All world are united to fight against COVID-19, as well as it will directly affect on the working class also. Economic slowdown, economic crisis has been prevailed in many parts of the world. Now we are talking to about the Australian context. Here, the two leaderships from the Communist Party of Australia, one is national president of the CPA and one is general secretary of CPA. So welcome, sir, in our news portal. So we have discussions today that lockdown and COVID-19 impact on the Australian working class. First of all, I have to please introduce yourself, and then we'll continue our discussions.
Okay, my name's Andrew Irving. I'm the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Australia. I've been a member of the party for 40 years, and I've been a leading member of both the youth organisation and the Communist Party.
Okay.
Yep, my name is Vinny Molina. I am based in Perth, Western Australia. I have been active in the trade union movement and the Communist Party for a number of years now, and here working always for the working class.
As we all know, due to lockdown and COVID-19 infections, the working class has a severe crisis. Actually, they lost their job, as well as their economic crisis has been prevailed. So what is the situation in Australia? Especially I'm asking to the General Secretary, what is the situation of the working class in Australia?
It's been fortunate that now I'm getting feedback now, so it's a bit difficult. Okay. It's been fortunate that the federal government has agreed to provide some resources to workers to cover the period where many workers are currently unemployed. But there's also large sections of the working class that aren't covered. So there's a very high proportion of casual workers in Australia. Believe it or not, university sector workers and a lot of migrant workers in Australia, visa workers in Australia. They're not covered by the special funding that was provided to cover workers over the period of lockdown. So the lockdown in some states has started to slowly being relieved, but it's left a very high proportion of the working class unemployed, and the government is probably going to announce in the next few days the reversal of the support for workers in the community. They funded child support, which meant that a lot of working women could put their children at no cost into child mining for when they went to work. But the first thing that they cut out is that free support for child mining. Not only did that affect women in the workforce, but it also meant that all the workers that currently work in that industry, which are mainly women, actually lost their financial support. So a lot of those businesses, their private businesses, will effectively mean that a lot of those will maybe close down because the government's actually went against what they said they were going to do and maintain funding for that industry. So we've got part of the workforce, I think Vinny can confirm this, but I think it's about 2.5 million workers that are on JobKeeper, which was a scheme to support workers who worked for employers so that they would stay in contact with their workplace. So the money flowed through the boss to the workers. That was meant to keep them in employment. But we've seen in the last week that some of the biggest employers have started sacking workers. The airline industry, Qantas, just sacked sacked 6,000 workers. And as I said, there's been a lot of corruption found with that process because all the money flows through those businesses. But then a large number of workers, visa workers in Australia, and also a lot of casual workers who have worked for less than a year with the employer, haven't been given any money. Particularly hard hit is visa workers or students that have been caught in Australia who can't return to their own country, and they've been left destitute. There's no work, there's no money, there's no nothing. So they're being the only way they're surviving is through charity, because there's no money available for them. So it's been a very difficult situation for a lot of workers, and we don't know what's going to happen once the economy starts up again.
I want to talk to National President of CPA. What is the situation in COVID-19 infection in Australia? Already we know that in New Zealand is a corona-free country, has been declared. What about in Australia?
Well, perhaps Australia has been a little bit lucky, but the federal government should have introduced a lockdown earlier than they did. It could have prevented several of the infections that happened, and taking care with some of the infections that come in from the cruise ships, where had a large number of people that some of them die unnecessarily because we didn't have those controls.
How many people have been infected right now? And currently?
Well, the number has been reduced considerably. Some states are not presenting any cases on a daily basis, but it has been a surge in recent times in Victoria, particularly in some suburbs in Melbourne. But some other states, like in Western Australia, we have had one or two cases in recent days, which is very minimum. And most of the activities, are restarting. In general, I think that the response has been all right by the people. The social distancing, that is what we see. But one of the key issues, like Comrade Andrew mentioned, is how workers were left behind on this exercise, and the failures of capitalism that we saw through the pandemic.
Actually, we saw in different parts of the world that the government has been giving the bailout package to the corporates as well as some peoples also. What about the Australian context? Is there any government help to the working class or anything else?
Yeah, like Andrew mentioned in his intervention, the government introduced two type of packages. Somehow they found $130 billion. The money has always been there. It's just that they always went into the private pockets of employers, particularly those who don't pay taxes. But they introduced a JobKeeper system, which was aimed at subsidizing the employers to pay workers to remain in the workplace. The idea was that the worker would get $1,500 a fortnight, and the employers would top it up, so workers would continue to work.
It's a contract-based or it's an agreement has been done? It's a contract-based agreement?
No, there wasn't a contract. It was just a scheme that was introduced very quickly, and some of the employees were working from home, and others who couldn't work from home had to isolate. And the demands from the Communist Party was that nobody should be left behind, and the government must introduce a system to keep people with some income.
I want to talk to Andrew. The situation is very grim. Especially in mining sector, people are losing the job. What about the mining authority? Is there all are private owned or public owned or government controlled?
You're talking about the coal mining industry, or? Yeah.
Mining
In
industry,
Aus-
coal mining, national reserve, national resources are there.
the mining industry is one of the most profitable sections of the Australian economy, and it's
Yeah.
definitely private. All owned by predominantly international companies. And at this particular time, they're going great guns. They're making huge amounts of profit. So that industry is forging ahead and making a lot of money. It's still going up and up. So the mining industry, and one of the problems with COVID is that a lot of the mining industry workers fly in and fly out of their workplaces. So that's still occurring. So about the only thing that's flying is workers going in and out of the mining industry. But yeah, that industry is still making a lot of money at the moment, and it's all private. And an interesting fact is that when government tried to take ownership of the mines back into government hands, they were removed with the support of the Americans. So if there's any questions of taking back control of the resources of Australia, there's always a big fight back. More recently, they tried to introduce a tax that actually was levied against the profits that they were making. They were making super profits until a few years ago. When they tried to introduce that, there was a massive campaign against the government at the time, and they lost the next election. So the mining industry will spend a lot of money to make sure that they don't lose control of the resources in our resources in the ground.
What about the production process is right now? Is it normalized, or it will again in lockdown?
Absolutely normalised. They're selling more iron ores being shipped out of Australia than ever. So it's absolutely normal at the moment.
So what I want to talk to Vinny. So what is the minimum wage system has been implemented in Australia? Is there any minimum wage system out there, or government or private factories do their own choice?
There is a system of minimum wage, which the party has always demanded a livable wage. It's around $740 per week, but it's not enough for a family to survive. You know, rents in Australia are very expensive, in between $300 to $400 per week. Food is expensive as well, petrol. In general, the minimum wage is not really a livable wage, and that has to be increased. Many workers work under enterprise agreements that can be union or non-union. Often the non-union agreements are just about the minimum wage, and the enterprise agreements organized by
It's all about the weekly basis or monthly basis.
weekly. Everything in Australia is done on a weekly basis. Yeah.
So payment system are in weekly or in monthly.
Weekly. You pay your rent on a weekly basis. You earn your wage on a weekly basis. There are some sections in construction, particularly in the tiling industry, where there's a lot of migrant workers. Many employers pay on a monthly basis, but it's not the trend in Australia.
Now, what about the movement? Because you are demanding more. So how it is to be possible with negotiation or in movement?
Negotiations in Australia have been very restricted. The bargaining, the enterprise bargaining, particularly in those areas where they're not highly unionized. But the unions play a very important role in society with trying to organize workers and try to achieve better wages and conditions for all.
Any legal battles or legal protection is there?
Yeah, well, you know, there is no right to strike in this country. It's very, very limited. And the only time workers can take some sort of protected action is during negotiations or a new enterprise agreement. But it is limited. Also, the fact that the union density has dropped consistently over the years to as low as 10% at the moment. 1 million workers belong to unions.
Vinny,
So
maybe you should
yeah,
say,
yeah, Andrew, I'll come to you.
yeah.
So, any no legal protections are there, as per your views. But how it will be possible to achieve your goals? Because achieve the working class demands.
But by getting organized, there is only one way for workers really to fight for the wages and conditions, and that is by getting organized in unions. I myself work in an industry where workers have to be organized to achieve everything. But for example, construction workers in Australia have two type of industrial relations, one for all workers in general, and one is specific for construction workers where the activity is criminalized. The right to organize has been criminalized. There is an organization called the Australian Building and Construction Commission, ABCC, that criminalizes the right to organize. They continue to harass and persecute union officials and individual workers in this country, something that shouldn't happen.
So I want to go to the Andrew. What is your view? How it will be achieved that the workers' demand if the legal protections are not there?
The struggle against the penal powers has been a long struggle in Australia. The last time we had such a massive campaign against the penal powers that followed the Second World War lasted for 15 years. And it took the whole union movement and eventually a general strike across the whole of Australia to withdraw the penal powers that were being applied at that time. There was a relatively short period of where the penal powers were still there, but they weren't being applied. But they're very much in place now. What Vinny didn't say was that he's just come out of a court case where his members in Western Australia, including him, were being fined hundreds of thousands of dollars. So they just won a court case where they were being fined $100,000. But his union has, in the last few years, has been fined $13 million Australian dollars. So where the union movement here has no legal right to take industrial action, and they've got some of the legal firms from the United States as well as Australia forever trying to find ways to stop workers taking industrial action. And my own union was stopped from taking industrial action by just using tricks under the current system in Australia. So very few opportunities are given to workers. And one of the biggest things that is happening is they're trying to find new ways of stopping workers from ever taking industrial action here.
It is very unfortunate because even in USA, there is some union activity also be recognized by the government. AFL-CIO is there. Okay, fine. The situation is very grim. And I am just talking to you. How much percentage government employees are there in Australia? How much? If you giving you a compare with the percentage.
Offhand, I couldn't tell you. I mean, I used to be a government worker. They privatised my industry, which is the railways, public transport railways. I'd say it's about 10% of the workforce in Australia would be public sector, and the union rate of unionisation, I think, is 15 to 17% now. So, the union rate is very low in Australia now, and the highest section is in the public sector. But every couple of months, they're trying to privatise more of the government sector, which means they're putting people in casual jobs. They're transferring all the public servants to the private sector, so big profits for the contractors that win the contract, and very poor conditions for the workers.
Yeah,
As we
probably
all,
another.
as we, yeah, Vidi, but I
Yeah,
just want
just
to,
to add to what Andrew mentioned, it has been a long process of privatization in Australia for the last 30 years, outsourcing, privatizing public enterprises, but the state continues to be one of the major employers. The problem is that they have introduced in the outsourcing a lot of labor hire. So many companies like Circle manage now government, prisons and hospitals, security, etc. And but there still continue to be a large proportion. Many of the members of the unions today are from the public sector. They continue to be more unionized than the private sector. So probably around 51% of the
as we, okay,
union
fine,
members.
okay, fine, you are right. But as we all know, the migrant workers are much more, uh, it's increasing day by day in Australia. What's their situation? How they will live, and how, is there getting any, what I'm saying, minimum wage system or any other protections are there, or they are working as a slave, especially in mining sector?
Well, you see, there is the idea that the more you earn, particularly you work in the mining sector, the less exploited you are. The reality is that here, people who work in the mining sector tend to earn a little bit of more money because they live away from their families, and they
Yeah.
earn. But the reality is that they get more exploited. There are some horrendous roster systems in the mining sector where workers can live for weeks and weeks away from their families, in similar to concentration camps put together by these mining corporations. There is a lot of mental health issues, a lot of suicides because people they don't have access to their families, they don't have access to good communication. Internet is bad in this country. And migrants in particular are more open to exploitation in some of the
From which
industries.
country they are coming from? Maximum peoples.
Well, in general, Australia is a very multicultural country. We got people from all over the world, but I have experience with a lot of Filipino, Indian migrant workers who came to this country and they believe that, it's sometimes a paradise, but it's not the case. If people
Right.
have no English language and they
Yeah.
don't know the rights, they're more open to exploitation than others, and employers take advantage. Fruit picking, for example, they always is done by migrant labor force, and often they get paid $5-6 an hour. That's impossible to live on the amount of money, but often workers of fear, we get in the sack, they don't join unions, or they feel intimidated. They come here, they sign contracts in the Philippines, and when they come to Australia, they have like slavery like conditions. They don't get paid, and they don't know where to go because the boss could control them by a visa system that brings them to this country with no rights.
But mining area, how many unions are active there? Is there any union active there in mining area?
Yes, there are several unions.
But why they are not fighting? Why they are not fighting against such brutal slavery?
all unions are doing a very good job in the country, and they defend workers, even those who, for whatever reason, don't join the unions. It is the fact that the laws are very restrictive today. Having access to the workplace, it is sometimes a challenge where union officials have to provide a 24-hour notice, and then they get obstructed by employers, and it is difficult to have access to the workers. They change the roster system, the breaks, and the only time you can actually speak to workers is during the meal breaks. And then you find, particularly now with COVID, you go to a building site or another type of workplace where workers start having breaks from 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. And they come in a small groups of people, and sometimes make it difficult to have access to them. Sometimes they fear the presence
True.
and choose not to join unions.
So coming back to Andrew, the many unions are active. What about the government facilities? What about the government proactiveness? Because the government has been elected by the democratically elected, and people's expectations are on the government side. So what is the government's view on that kind of inhuman act practice in Australia?
Well, I mean, both Conservative government and Labor governments have promoted visit workers. I mean, our university sector relies on a huge quantity of migrant students coming into Australia, but the number of visa workers in Australia is in the millions. So it dwarfs migrants coming in to live in Australia. There's a huge number of workers coming in, and they are coming in from a lot of European countries where there's been depressed circumstances. So Irish, Italian, Greek, we've had another wave of Greek migrants. We're one of the biggest Greek migrant populations because there's no work in Europe. So apart from a lot of Asian countries and India, etc., there's a huge number of workers coming in. Now, they've put in various visa categories to allow these workers to come in, and they've made it much easier because a lot of these migrant workers don't necessarily need to prove their qualifications. So we had a problem with doctors coming into Australia, nurses coming into Australia,
Right.
without qualifications. Now, of those categories of workers, there's only one category that provides any protection for those workers coming in. They're supposed to be coming in to meet the needs that they're short of those workers in Australia, but they don't monitor that. So, in fact, over the last couple of years, one of the biggest campaigns is exposing all the exploitation. So the trade union movement has been working through some of the lower skilled areas, exposing the fact that there's all of these workers that are getting very low wages, because just remember, they're on a bond. If they kick up a fuss, the boss can withdraw their work, and then they can be kicked out of the country.
Yeah.
So they're getting workers to work 40 hours and then pay them
40 hours means 40 hours in weekly? No.
They'll work them for more hours than they're actually paid. So
it's like overtime, I think so.
No, you don't get paid for it. All they do is they say you've got to work for 15 hours, but we'll only pay you for 7 hours. So the total rate that they're paid is well below our minimum wage. Then in a lot of areas, and like they were saying, they're working in farming areas or mining areas. One of the things they are bound to do is to hire accommodation from the employer, but they'll put 3 times as many people into a house and charge them twice as much as the house would normally cost. So a house that costs $400 normally to rent, they'll put 10 workers in there and charge them $400 each for their accommodation. So they're forever sort of defrauding those workers. They then get them to work in very unsafe conditions because they don't provide the proper protective equipment. They have them working out. They don't provide water for them. They work them for long hours. And if they kick up any fuss, of course, they can be sacked.
It is very difficult how you protect them. It is very difficult.
where in Australia, I mean, the unions have had to find new ways. So some of the union that deals in the farming sector, they've actually started sending some union representatives to the countries that these workers are coming from and trying to be in contact with the agency that provide those workers so that they actually have contact with the workers before they come here. They're also working in some of these farming areas and trying to unionise the workers in that area. This is a new way of working. With
Yeah.
a lot of the workers in a lot of the shopping, the cafes and everything like that, a lot of those workers in the what we say the hospitality industry, there's a lot now of what they call community unions. That means a worker can be a member of that union initially at no cost. So they can come along, they can get advice about what their conditions and what their wages should be. And then if they get enough support, they will then picket a workplace that is underpaying their workers and try and embarrass that employer to properly pay those people. And there's just there's some of the, I don't know, in India it may be these cooking programs, the cooking programs they have on TV with these celebrity cooks. Recently there's been a number of those celebrity cooks here that have been found where they own 3 or 4 restaurants that they're underpaying their workforce by millions of dollars, not hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars.
But simply they're silent. On that discrimination.
Well, the only reason we find out is because the union does a job of working with all of these young workers who are here, who are bound to they've got to be very careful, and they talk to them and find out that they're working many more hours than they're supposed to and what they're getting paid for, and then they make a big issue of it within the media, and some of these celebrity chefs have now gone out of business because it's been exposed that they're underpaying their workers millions of dollars, so it's been a exposure of how they're exploiting all of these millions of workers that are coming in from overseas.
It's very, very unfortunate and very grim situations. We all know the capitalist and very developed country is Australia. Many people have dreamed to get a job in there. So it is the real situations. Our viewers know the real situations from your mouth. So I am going to the
it's really good though. The young people that are coming, the young workers that are coming, will work with the union to expose these situations.
Yeah,
I mean, obviously they have an interest, but they're not afraid. They'll work with other young people to expose these workplaces.
So I'm going to Vinny. I'm talking about the Aboriginal peoples, because Australia is lots of Aboriginal peoples. Right now they are minority in the economic upliftment also. They are very much discriminated in the Australia. What is the situations right now? What do you find about the Aboriginal people's rights?
Well, you see, as a national minority, they were dispossessed of the land when there was the invasion more than 200 years ago. They continue to be highly exploited, discriminated. There is a lot of racism. And we always said that, white labor will never be free until black labor is totally free. So as a party, we continue to demand the sovereignty for Aboriginal people that was never ceded, the land rights, and they must have a say. Because one of the key issues at the moment why they continue to exploit them and try to keep them away from the land is the multinational corporations in the mining sector are mining. Rio Tinto recently, they destroyed these Aboriginal caves, more than 46,000 years old. And BHP now had been granted the right to go and destroy more of the heritage. So the situation is bad for Aboriginal people in the
Which
country.
area the Aboriginal peoples are living there right now in Australia?
They are all over the place. They live in the bush, or in Aboriginal communities, or in the cities. And the situation is particularly precarious for Indigenous people in the cities, where there is homelessness, there is lack of jobs, lack of
But if
education
you see in
opportunities.
mainstream media, in World Cup competition is going on and other cricket tournament is going on, we will find the Aboriginal peoples are very happy. They are very much getting privileged to live there. So why such kind of disinformation, misinformations are there?
Well,
Is there
because
any reason?
the mass media controls the information around the world. Australia is not the exception. And the mass media always try to present the capitalist system. It provides happiness for the people, that there are no problems, that everybody's happy. So that's one of the issues. They hide the reality, and you repeat a lie so very often that people
Even
tend to
you
believe it.
see in Papua New Guinea, there the tribal peoples also discriminated by the Australian army. Is that true?
It is true. They try to protect the interests of the mining corporations in Papua New Guinea. And you see, that is happening. There's a big struggle around the world for Aboriginal rights in the United States, in Canada, in Latin America, and here in Australia. The big difference is that in Australia there is a national minority.
But they are getting the voting rights, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, under capitalism, having the right to vote doesn't guarantee, that the will of the people will be upheld, particularly in a two-party system, in an electoral system that we have like
But
in
the issues
Australia.
are there for the Aboriginals' rights in the election.
Well, there is, for the first time, we have some Aboriginal people who have been elected to Parliament. I think that unfortunately they don't represent the interests of the Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people will have to continue to fight, getting organized for the rights, and eventually they're gonna win. The Communist Party of Australia was one of the first organizations to fight for Indigenous rights, for the right to land, and it was heavily involved during the referendum in 1967. So it has been the necessity for people to get organized as a national minority, as a working class, as a gender issue. Is only the organization of the people that can guarantee social change.
So I'm going to the Andrew. Andrew, what is the situation in women equality in Australia? We can find out that there's a big changes in social reform in Australia. Is that true? That women are getting much more liberal in that country?
The capitalist system always attempts to divide the community. So even though only through the struggle of working people over a long period of time has more equality been created. So the united struggle of all workers has won better conditions for women. We were only having a discussion a few days ago that in 1950, the courts here made a ruling that women in Australia were allowed to earn 75% of a man's wage. So they actually made a ruling that,
but not 100%, only 75.
and
So
they could be doing exactly the same job.
Discrimination.
Yeah, but that didn't change until the 80s in Australia. So it was officially the situation here that women only earn 75%. In 1953, that was estimated to be worth, at that time, £60 million in Australia. So you can imagine that's a lot of money then, and it's a lot of money now. Now, even now, I think the percentage, the average percentage is only 85%. that's not by law, but the reality is that they've maintained the position where they've undermined the conditions of women within a lot of the industries that they're concentrated in and paid lower wages. A good example is kindergartens and child minding centres, where there's a requirement for very highly qualified people to work in those industry because it's considered education now. So 3-4-year-old children. So there's a requirement that they be the equivalent of a teacher, yet their wages are the equivalent of a shop assistant. That's how much they're actually getting paid. So in so many industry where there's high concentration of women, very low wages. So it's been a very heavy campaign by the trade union movement, but the situation's only very slowly improving. And so, you know, that's just one area. The big struggle that the party has had is trying to develop unity between all sections of the community. Of course, in Australia, there's been, a large part of the population is migrants. I mean, basically all the white fellas are migrants.
Right.
But, I mean, the reality is that over the last 200 years, we've had many migrants coming into Australia, and they've sought to divide the population in Australia by attempting to have worker against worker. And one of the great successes of the Communist Party has been developing unity between workers, and that's why we were so successful in improving the conditions in Australia, through developing that unity. And the party's demographic is very broad, and we have had many workers from Italian, Greek, Lebanese backgrounds, and many others. Now, more recently, Indian and other communities, Vietnamese now. So we focus on that because we know that disunity in the working class is a poison, and they've been very successful, like a lot of other Western countries, in focusing on the Muslim community or some other section of the community to try and divide the working class. And it has been successful in Australia as well. So we spend a lot of our time trying to develop unity despite that in Australia. And that's one of the big struggles that we have to try and develop unity.
Yeah, great. We are finishing line. We are in the finishing line. So I just want to talk about the medical healthcare system. In many countries, we will find out, even in Britain, there's a national healthcare systems are implemented. What about in Australia, and how the people get the medical benefits?
You're asking, Vinny?
Yep.
Yeah,
We've got a
Vinny.
system called the Medicare, where, we have been very lucky, despite the fact that it has been undermined. Eventually they want to get into a system similar to the United States, privatizing our health system. But the pandemic actually brought the attention that the system of privatizing hospitals, it doesn't work. Here, during the pandemic, they had to hire back some of the private hospitals and nurses because the system has been decimated. The Medicaid is underfunded.
Is there any Mediclaim policies out there? Any Mediclaim policies for the workers?
Yes, everybody is protected by the Medicare system, but they have introduced a lot of incentives for people to abandon the public system and go into the private through the private health insurance, and they give a 30% rebate. And convince some people that saying, listen, rather than paying a little bit of extra tax, you get into the private sector and you get 30% discount. And the money comes from the public sector, unfortunately. But it is the best system. We campaign for universal access for medical care for all workers and all people in Australia. And probably in relation to this in the UK, the system is a little bit better than here. But we still got the PBS, the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, where pensioners paid
Who will
around
give that
$6.
kind of benefits? Is the government or any other private government ownerships or partnerships are there?
It is mainly the public, but they have been given to the insurance corporations, most of the running of laboratories and some of the private hospitals and medicines.
Actually, from India, many people, even in healthcare professionals, are going to the Australia for the job. So, what is any mechanism? What is the mechanism out of there to evaluate that they are fitted or not?
Andrew, do you want to?
What is the mechanisms are there? Andrew, please.
The mechanisms. There's a.
Because many Indians are there.
What happened was that in the system here, of course, you tend to get concentrations of doctors in the more affluent areas. But for the public sector, it's very difficult, especially in a lot of country areas, to get doctors. So there's been a system to try and sponsor doctors to come from overseas. And when I said earlier about the fact that they don't monitor their qualifications as well if they come in as a contractor. So if somebody wants to immigrate to Australia and they're a qualified doctor, they've got to pass medical exams in Australia. But if you're a contractor, you can be hired from overseas, come into Australia without necessarily
for stipulated time or for the indefinite period. For stipulated time or indefinite period.
Say it again, please.
For the contract has been made for the stipulated time or for indefinite period.
Well, it is indefinite because some of those doctors, I mean, a lot of those doctors are good. There's no question. A lot of those doctors are good. I know that the Indian doctors are very good. We absolutely rely on them because in a lot of country areas we cannot get doctors, because it's too expensive for people to get the qualification, and it's a very difficult situation in a lot of areas. We have old doctors who want to give up practicing because of their age, but they can't get new doctors. So in a lot of areas, you can't get doctors. So it's the only way that we can get medical people into those areas.
There is a problem with that system because it becomes a brain drain. We really taking the doctors from third world countries, and the government should actually fund the education system and create, more places for university students to go to medical school and train doctors in this country. The doctors came and often they abandon their own countries that have actually paid for the education, and we don't pay for the education here. And they come and work in lower conditions than other local doctors.
Actually, as we all know, the all banking system in Australia has been privatized. And during the lockdown period, many workers had lost their jobs. And those who are in EMI and loan repayment, if they are failed to do that, what is the procedure? But actually, bank also be insolvent if they're not getting the earn from the EMI or loan. What is going to things happen in banking system right now in Australia?
I think that the banks continue to make profit all the time. With the home loans, there is a moratorium. The party, one of the campaigns was for a moratorium in rents and mortgages. So they're not paying for up to 6 months. Depends on the circumstances of people, but they continue to profiteer with the housing sector, with credit cards, with everything. You're right. All of them are privatized now. We don't have a national bank. We should really have a people's bank, that is in public hands. But at the moment, everything has been privatized.
Both guests, we should thank to them because they taking their precious time. We are taking their precious time. Right now, in Andrew's area, it's 11 o'clock, right?
Correct. It's 11 o'clock here, but
11 o'clock in night.
we've been doing a lot of these sort of things. So when they go to 1 o'clock in the morning, that's when it gets a bit late.
but very much informative situation, informative data has been coming from that kind of discussions. We'll coming back again in other issues in Australia, about the Australia. So take care, stay safe. That's only one thing I have to tell. And working class movement should go on and flourish. Any last word from your side?
Well, just to invite all workers, we always do this, to join the unions. And obviously for many migrants that come to this country, particularly many comrades from India that came from CPIM, to join our party, to join the Communist Party of Australia. This is the Fraternal Party that can look after also the interests against this rapacious capitalism, and we can get organized together.
And Andrew, any last words for our viewers?
I've been a solidarity activist for a long time, and in fact I was having a union meeting tonight with international solidarity with the region. So we were talking about the COVID campaign across the whole of the Asia Pacific area. So I extend our solidarity to the workers in India and all through the Asia Pacific region, and we've always taken a very good big interest in the workers in India, and we extend our solidarity to them and will in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for
See you.